And I want to talk specifically about your views on the nexus of finance and data analytics. There's all sorts of opportunities. My students can start now, and some of these are going to evolve throughout their lives. But can you talk a little bit now about what that nexus looks like to you and how you see those two fields coming together?
Absolutely. I think so. The thing that actually led me to finance, other than just Dr. Cole being Dr. Cole and who wouldn't want to go and work for Dr. Cole, um, was that she showed me a world of so much information that you could be looking at. And I had been loving my econometrics class and really enjoying that way of using statistics to look at the world of business and the world of econ. And then she suddenly showed me how much more information there was and how much faster that information could come in, and how the great variety of information. You've got the four V's of data: the volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. And she showed me through Bloomberg so much data that was so interesting. But then I started thinking, well, as the folks around me are looking into how they're going to do things like value investing, they're doing so much of the work just looking at numbers in front of them, and that's an important thing to do to start to understand them. But how do you scale that up? And how do you start to look at those things across a lot of different equities or a lot of different companies, or across different markets? And how do you shift those things when you move from one industry to another one? And as you look at the challenges that scaling provides, one of the easiest ways to deal with that is to start programming. And in a way, that means to start writing code that will do portions that you can express in math for you, and we'll do them repeatedly and all such as that. But another piece is just the task of learning to say, these are the parts of the analysis that really are mathematical and that I can start to codify right into code in some way, as a mathematical function. These are things that I can do. All the sanity checks that we're constantly doing every time we are once again hitting a macro in Excel, you're going to look through it and you're going to say, do these numbers even make sense? Well, a lot of those sanity checks are things that you could, in fact, write code to do, that are going to say, hey, other than sometimes oil running below the price of zero, in general, we would expect, if this price is going to go below zero, I want to know about it. That's a strange thing, and I want to be told. Or if the price of this stock jumps by a portion of the price that seems excessive, I would like to know that. And so these are things that within statistics, you start to learn how to describe in math what you would be doing as a sanity check, and they just become data checks in the world of data science, which allows you to then start saving time for the more intuitive work that is necessary to ask the question, so this price jumped, why did it jump? And that's the sort of thing that you aren't going to necessarily be able to write in code. But I wanted to see what you could do to help scale up the parts that were honestly less interesting. Looking for a narrative as an intel officer, that's the bread and butter. That's the fun part, is asking what is actually going on with GameStop. It is less fun to just sort of plow through a whole bunch of charts and say, which of these charts is doing something that seems weird today? And so scaling up that portion of your thinking and offloading it onto a computer program, even if that program is Excel, is a huge benefit, and one that every day I'm helping our market experts by finding things programmatically that seem interesting and saying, hey, this might be something to look into. If you happen to know what it is, you could write articles about it. You could look into what's happening in this particular market that's acting weirdly. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces, is starting to think about how you would codify your thinking so that you can save the fun stuff for yourself and let the computer do the boring things.
Yeah. How about more on the statistics side? I know that you and I have had conversation about how, at least when we began our path in finance, we kind of fixate on individual numbers. So it's expectations, expected return is 12%. The beta is 1.2%. The net present value of this project is $1.3 million. And we spend a tremendous amount of time just getting to that single number, which is great, which is sort of a building block to sort of getting to good decision making. But in finance, we need to not just think about the expectation, we need to think about risk. And risk is really more about a distribution of potential outcomes. And you've told me in the past how you can you sort of see the world as distributions and as opposed to mean values. And I think you can explain that really well to people. But I think you have the ability to bring that into what your job is and the like. So could you talk just a little bit about that sort of meshing between finance and statistics and analytics?
Absolutely. My favorite thing in statistics is time series analysis, and it's always so fun anytime I see a graph that has a prediction out into the future, and you've got the bars, and the bars are exactly the same distance away from the prediction all the way out into the future. And I think to myself, well, I have a much better idea of what's going to go on tomorrow than I do of what's going on next year. And it is this moment of realizing, oh, the thing I get to do with this client is I get to talk to them about distributions, because sure, you want to know that best guess of what the value is going to be, but you're always going to turn around and do your scenario analysis. You're going to talk about what the best case is and what your worst case is, and you're going to set bounds. And all you're doing when you're talking about those is you're describing a distribution. You've got the distribution, if it's a normal distribution or another bell-shaped curve, and you're talking about the median or about the mean, depending, and then you're going to talk about the boundaries for them. But the reality is very few of those distributions really just look like a perfect normal curve. And so the secret weapon that you get to have in your back pocket, if you learn to think, this person wants me to describe it as a summary, maybe just the average, maybe they want best case, worst case. But while what they want is the simplest way for me to describe that distribution, what I know is my planning process needs to account for the tails. It needs to account for the fact that ruin is a thing that happens. And it's a thing that I love that students right now, while it has been a weird time and the pandemic has done a lot of horrible things, it has made us a lot smarter about understanding that there are risks that we're not seeing. And whether you want to call them black swans or not, at the end of the day, there are places where it's very hard to describe what the expected value is, especially when it is such a wide distribution. And it's that width of the distribution that really is important to us at FreightWaves, because there is so little transparency, and the lack of transparency is going to lead to a wider distribution for, in our case, for pricing of trucking. But also everywhere else that you're going, when your boss is asking you to describe that single number and you give them that single number, if you have the ability to say, but hey, it's important for you to know that the way that we've calculated this leaves a huge margin of error. And there are risks inherent to this that may drop that way down below, but also there are ways that you can increase it, the way that you would even get to a distribution rather than a point forecast of something, which net present value always seemed strange to me, because, well, we can talk about it as a present value, but really it's just a sum of forecasts, which I love. But when you're talking about that, to get to a distribution, you have to think through all of the subordinate distributions. So if you are looking at your revenue and a forecast of your revenue and what that is likely to look like, there are parts of that that are going to be affected by, say, marketing. And that marketing is going to have some degree of effectiveness. And if you can get with the marketing people and have some idea of the distribution of likely effectiveness, then you can start understanding, well, how does that distribution affect the distribution of the outcome of revenue, which allows you to then be the person who sits between those two and says, and hey, by the way, a lot of this variation is going to come from how well we do marketing, or a lot of this variation is going to come from how well we deal with the volatility in supply chain costs. And once you can start saying the volatility in that eventual outcome of revenue is driven more by the volatility in this little corner, the better decision you can help your boss make about where to put their time and their effort in minimizing costs, maximizing the effectiveness of some process. And so that becomes the even greater value you can add on top of just being able to plug the numbers in and get that single number that comes out the far end.
Yeah. So as we're wrapping up here, I do want to ask you to quickly comment on one other thing, and it's related to distributions. And so of late, there's been a term that keeps popping up in many different contexts, and that term is tail risk. So I hear people talking about tail risk all the time. And so just as we close, can you just bring that into this conversation? Talk about, so what is tail risk? Give us just a kind of a quick, tangible example of it and how that enters into these types of conversations.
Absolutely. I love that because in the notes that I had about stuff that was worth talking about, the very last thing that I'm looking at right here is tail risk. It is, so from a statistical standpoint, you are talking about the risk that the outcome is going to be in the very far edges of whatever that distribution of outcomes is going to be. And so when we're talking about, our usual alpha of 5% or 2.5% on the edges, it is an outcome that is so unlikely that you probably didn't even think about it. It is an outcome that you certainly thought was so unlikely that you wouldn't want to have to tell your stockholders that this is where I put my money. I put my money up against the possibility that there was going to eventually be a pandemic, because there were people who told us and who have been telling us for years, there is going to eventually be a pandemic. It wasn't a surprise that there was one, but it was certainly a surprise when it happened and exactly how it happened. And so because it was so unlikely, because it was a tail risk, it was a risk that we had said, that's so far outside, I'm not going to spend my capital, my resources dealing with it. It was a risk that sort of, and this is not a part of why it's a tail risk, but it sort of swept underneath us and knocked a lot of us over. Certainly in the world of trucking, a lot of that tail risk has come in the form of, first, companies that ended up folding because there just was not the same ability to move freight at the very beginning. But then you have all of these follow-on effects of a company goes out of business. That means that their trucks have to go to somebody, but their drivers go somewhere and they don't necessarily go together. And all of a sudden you've wound up with what we have now, which is a shortage of drivers throughout the market, which becomes a follow-on tail risk that just keeps driving prices upward. And so one of the most important things about tail risk is that if you ignore it completely, if you just say that is very unlikely, I think there is a 99% probability that that will not happen. Well, 99% of the time you'll be fine, but that 1% of the time is going to happen. And when it does happen, you're going to be caught unawares. But also, when you are caught unawares, as our global supply chain has become more and more interwoven, as financial markets have become more and more interwoven with everything, those areas of tail risk on somebody else's books are becoming tail risks on yours. And so the interconnectedness of those unforeseen events, and the fact that if you're not paying attention to your own tail risk, you can bet that the people you're dealing with are probably not dealing with theirs as well. It just becomes this strange compounding thing that we're watching occur all over the earth right now. That said, I understand that it's a hard conversation to have. It is always hard to say, I think this thing is really unlikely, but it's possible. My hope is that an outcome from us all hearing about tail risk all the time right now is that we'll slowly become better at having that conversation in the planning process and saying, hey, do we need to set aside resources to deal with the very, very, very unexpected? And I'm very hopeful that we will.
All right. Well, and this is a conversation that I know we could continue this all day long, and
Absolutely.
at some point I want to come back to this, but for now, thanks so much, David. Thanks for your time. I'm sure my students will enjoy listening to this as well. And great work. Thanks for all that you're doing.
I appreciate the opportunity. Go UT.
All right. Thanks.